The sun leaned hard on Bell's Junction, pressing shadows flat against the trailers and scrap walls. Kael felt the heat through the soles of his boots, rising from the cracked asphalt like a held breath. He stood at the edge of the trading yard, near the fuel hoarder's rusted tank, his hands loose at his sides. A dozen steps away, two men argued over dented jerrycans. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the wind, fine as milled bone. The faint reek of diesel and old sweat mixed with something sharper, creosote from the patched roofs, maybe, or the metallic tang of fear that never quite left a settlement this small. Kael scanned the horizon the way he always did before finishing a deal, slow, patient, reading the distance. To the west, a brown smudge climbed the sky. Dust, he thought, just dust. But he marked it. He marked everything. That was the habit that had kept him alive when sharper men with rifles were already bones in the alkali flats. He carried no rifle. Just the notebook. The trade was water for fuel. 3 sealed plastic drums of sweet water from his cache at the old Chevron station, still good, still rat-free, for enough diesel to push his truck and the 2 trailers another 100 miles. The fuel hoarder, a slab of a man named Harlan Meeks, had the only working pump in Bell's Junction. A hand-cranked rig bolted to a 1,000-gallon tank, guarded by a mangy dog and Meeks's 2 sons, both of whom watched Kael with the flat, hungry eyes of boys who had learned early that water was worth more than blood. "You want 3 drums?" Meeks said, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "Water's cheap now. Fuel's not. That'll be 2 drums per 5 gallons. Kael didn't blink. "That's twice what we agreed last spring." "Was last spring. Now it's now." Kael glanced at the settlement around them. Bell's Junction was a knot of repurposed shipping containers, chain link, and hand-painted signs. It had survived because it sat far enough off the old highway, and because people like Meeks hoarded fuel and charged what the market would bear. The market, today, was a gun pressed to a dry throat. He saw a woman carrying a plastic bucket with a crack patched in duct tape. She walked past the well, dry as a dead man's mouth, toward the cistern where Meeks's men stood guard. The price of that bucket would be paid in something other than coin. He pulled out his notebook. Not the small one, the ledger. Black leather, cracked along the spine, pages swollen from sweat and use. He flipped it open to a page marked with a strip of yellow electrical tape. Meeks watched. "What's that?" "A record of debts," Kael said. "You owe me. 2 years ago, you borrowed a hand pump and a length of hose after yours cracked. You promised a favor. You still owe that favor." Meeks's face went flat. "That was nothing. A loan. Loans have terms." Kael turned the notebook slightly so Meeks could see the line. The handwriting was small and precise, the ink a faded blue. June. 14 liters of diesel, old pump, 2 meters of hose. Repayment, 1 favor, unsecured. Then below it, in red, your name, your still. The word still landed like a stone in a shallow well. Meeks's eyes cut to the side, toward the shed behind the trading post. Kael didn't need to look. He knew the still was there, buried under canvas and salvage, producing a trickle of ethanol from fermented cactus pulp and old bread. Knew because the ledger told him, and because he had traded the yeast to Meeks's wife 3 months ago, a thin, nervous woman named Cora who had paid him in a coil of copper wire and a promise. "Everyone in Bell's Junction knows you've got the only fuel," Kael said, keeping his voice low, almost conversational. "But they don't know you've been running a still behind that shed, using water from the settlement's ration. If they knew, you'd have a line of thirsty people with knives before sundown." Meeks's jaw worked. "You'd sell me out. I'd collect on the favor." Kael closed the ledger but kept it in his hand. The leather was warm from his body, the edges soft as old skin. "You sell me the diesel at last spring's rate, 2 drums of water for 10 gallons. That's fair. And you owe me the favor, which I'll collect now. You'll tell me if anyone's been asking about my routes. You'll tell me when the last scavenger crew came back. And you'll tell me where they went." Meeks stared at him, then at the dust on the horizon. "Fine. 2 drums, 10 gallons. You drive a hard bargain." "It's not hard. It's just math." The trade proceeded, but Kael kept scanning. The dust was taller now, wider. Not a single plume but a wall, rolling low. He counted the seconds between gusts. The wind was wrong. It blew from the north, but the dust rose from the southeast, along the old highway. That was his route. The route he'd used to reach Bell's Junction. He marked the discrepancy in his mind, a black entry in a ledger that had no paper. Meeks's older son, a thin boy of 12 with his father's slab shoulders not yet filled in, rolled out a hand cart with a metal tank strapped to it. The diesel gurgled, dark and thick, smelling of old engines and desperation. Kael handed over 2 drums, and Meeks's men carried them toward the cistern, each step kicking up more dust. The drums sloshed, and Kael could smell the water, faint and clean, as it passed. He watched the dust. "How long have you been seeing that?" he asked Meeks. Meeks squinted west. "Dust storm. Gets them this time of year. Nothing to worry about." But the dust was moving against the wind, too fast, too coherent. Kael's stomach tightened. A dust storm didn't carry a rhythm. This did. A pulse, like a heartbeat, felt through the ground more than heard. The dog by the fuel tank began to whine, then backed away, tail tucked. He turned to Meeks, voice hardening. "The scavenger crew. How long since they came back?" Meeks frowned. 3 days. Maybe 4. They should have been back yesterday. Why? What were they wearing? Bells? Bells Junction has a custom, scavengers tie handmade bells to their packs, right? For luck. Yeah. Old habit. They make them from scrap metal and shell casings. Why? Kael didn't answer. He looked down the main path between the containers. A woman was hanging laundry, faded shirts and pants snapping in the wind. A child played with a rusted toy car, pushing it through the dust. The settlement's bell tower, a leaning pole with a cracked iron bell, hung silent. That bell should have been rung at the first sign of strangers, at the first sign of trouble. It hadn't made a sound. The dust was closer now, maybe a mile out. It resolved into a black wave. Not brown grit, but black, shifting, glinting. The glint came from metal, hundreds, thousands of small bells. They did not ring. The wave was silent. That was the worst part. 100 walking things, 1,000, and the only sound was the soft scuff of their feet on the cracked earth, swallowed by distance. Kael's hand went to his chest, where the ledger rested in an inner pocket, and he felt the weight of it like a second heart. The wave moved along the old highway, following it. The same highway he'd driven. The same route he'd marked in his notebook as safe. "Meeks," he said, "get everyone inside. Now." Meeks stared. "What are you?" Then he saw it. The color drained from his face. The black wave reached the first outlying shack, a lean-to of corrugated iron and plastic sheeting. It didn't stop. It flowed over and through, and the shack collapsed with a sound like a tin can crushed under a boot. There were no screams. The wave moved with a terrible, deliberate silence. Kael grabbed Meeks's arm. "The fuel. Leave it. Run." He turned toward his truck, a rust-bitten flatbed with 2 dented trailers, parked at the edge of the yard. The engine was already running, he'd left it idling, a habit from years of quick exits. He swung into the cab, slammed the door, and looked back. Meeks was running toward the trading post, shouting. The woman dropped her laundry. The child dropped the toy car. The wave reached the first container. Bell-wearing mutants, the things that had once been men and women, walked in a loose formation, silent and black. The bells around their necks and wrists and ankles, made from scrap, shell casings, bottle caps, swayed but didn't ring. Maybe they'd been muffled, or maybe the things didn't move fast enough. Kael saw faces, pale and expressionless, eyes fixed forward. They didn't run. They walked. A black wave of walking things, each one wearing a scavenger's bell. One of them wore a bell Kael recognized. A small brass bell, handmade, dented on one side. He'd seen it 3 days ago, tied to the pack of a scavenger named Reyes, a woman who owed him 2 liters of iodine. She'd gone out along the old highway, heading east toward the reservoir. Now her bell hung around the neck of a thing that had once been a man, its chest split open, ribs white against. Chapter_title, Debtor's Convoy. Content, Kael drove with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed flat against the fuel gauge, not because the needle mattered but because the rattle in the engine had become a second heartbeat. The dust caked the windshield in pale streaks, and every few miles he had to wipe a clear eye-hole with his sleeve. Behind him, Bell's Junction had dropped below the heat shimmer, a smudge of leaning posts and black smoke that refused to rise. In the side mirror the road looked empty, but he knew it wasn't. The horde was still back there somewhere, a black line folded behind the curvature of the earth, /n and the convoy kept a loose string behind him. His own flatbed truck carried 6 survivors pressed against the spare tire and 1 box of salvaged iodine. A rust-pitted pickup carried 3 more, 2 of them children. The water hauler came last, its rear panel missing so the tank showed through like a ribcage. He had taken the water not because he trusted the driver, a one-eyed woman named Kael, but because she owed him a fuel filter and a truth. Bell's Junction had not produced many debts worth keeping. At the last stop, he had counted 17 people and 2 canteens of water. Now there were 9 people, 3 vehicles, and no room for grief, /n near mile marker 81, Kael slowed and flicked his lights twice. Engines died behind him, and the silence that followed was worse than the roar. It had a weight, a pressure against the ears, like the air before a storm. He took the jerry can from the footwell and climbed out. The heat came up through his boot soles. The asphalt had softened enough to take impressions, and each step felt like walking on a bruise, /n capful, he said /n and the first person in line was an old woman with sunsplit hands, her name gone from her own mouth, but she knew the shape of a ration. She cupped her hands, and Kael unscrewed the plastic cap, filled it to the brim, and poured it into her palm. She licked the water out of her skin and nodded without meeting his eyes. Next came a man with a blood-crusted ear, then a girl who looked maybe 9, then 2 brothers sharing a blanket, then a thin woman with a cough that sounded like tearing cloth. Each got 1 capful. No more, /n Kael drank his own from the same cap. He tilted it against his lower lip, let the water pool behind his teeth, and swallowed only when his throat stopped cramping. Then he capped the can and moved on. The water sloshed, a sound that made every eye in the convoy track him like a sun, /n at the flatbed. Maren Holt sat with her back against the cab. Her right forearm was wrapped in a strip of canvas gone brown at the edges. Below it, the skin had swollen into a dark, glossy tightness. She watched the jerry can as if it were a thing she might bite, /n that's not enough, she said. Her voice was low and cracked, but it carried, /n it's the ration, /n I'm bleeding through this rag, she lifted her arm. A fly crawled along the knot. If I die before Red Mesa, you lose a pair of eyes. I know where the wells are, /n Kael didn't look away. He didn't step closer either. Behind her, one of the brothers sat up to listen, and the vehicle's suspension creaked. The cut-browed scavenger called Joran was already watching. Everyone was watching, because extra water was never just water. It was hierarchy, and they all wanted to know which way the scales would tip, /n show me, Kael said, /n Maren shifted and pulled a square of oilcloth from inside her shirt. It had been folded so many times the creases were white as old bone. She spread it on her knee. The ink had faded to a thin brown, but the lines were still sharp, 3 circles west of Red Mesa, 1 crossed out, 1 marked with a sulfur sigil, 1 circle twice, /n hidden wells, she said. My brother dug the first. The second is poison. The third is sweet and deep, but you have to drop past the burning shale, /n Kael squatted. He set the jerrycan upright in the dirt, close enough that she could smell it, not close enough that she could snatch it. Then he took out the ledger. The cover was soft as old leather from use, and the pencil stub rode in a loop of twine. Under the section for water sources, he copied the map in short, hard strokes. He noted the odometer reading from the last marker, the shape of the ridge behind the third well, the crosshatch that meant stable ground. When he finished, he handed the oilcloth back, but only after folding the image into his memory, /n you'll get 3 caps now, he said. /1 for the map, 1 for keeping your mouth shut about it, and 1 because you're useful, /n Joran leaned forward, the cut across his brow pulling white. She gets extra and my boy doesn't, /n Kael didn't turn. He filled the cap and poured it into Maren's mouth, then did it twice more while the others watched, each pour slower than the last. When he finished, he screwed the cap back on and looked at Joran. His voice was flat enough to carry past the water hauler, /n your boy gets the next cap. Same as everyone. Maren bought herself 3. You want extra, show me something worth more. The sun sat low over the western ridgeline, a cracked, bleeding wound, as Kael led the debtors' convoy up the last stretch of ancient highway toward Red Mesa. Heat still rose from the pavement in shimmering waves, and every breath tasted of dust and scorched sage. Behind him, 17 men, women, and children from Bell's Junction shuffled forward with the careful economy of people who understood exactly how little water remained in their canteens. Their shadows stretched behind them like frayed ropes. No one spoke above a whisper. The only sounds were the crunch of boots on loose gravel and the soft, rhythmic rattle of a few scavenger bells still tied to pack straps, bells that now seemed less like warnings and more like funeral chimes. Kael's own pack weighed heavy, not with weapons but with the leather-bound ledger tucked inside his coat, its pages dense with debts, water sources, and safe routes. He carried no rifle. The guards wouldn't care. Red Mesa loomed ahead, a fortress of rusted steel, concrete rubble, and coiled razor wire, built around the remains of an old truck stop and a handful of adobe storehouses. Its walls had grown since his last pass, new timber shoring, a second watch platform, and a gate that looked like it had been ripped from the side of a fuel tanker. Rifle barrels tracked them as they approached, catching the last red light. "Hold there." A voice sharpened by a speaker horn cut through the dry air. "No closer." Kael stopped. He raised one empty hand, fingers spread. The other stayed inside his coat, his fingertips brushing the worn leather of the ledger. Behind him, the convoy halted with a scuff of boots. A baby coughed, a dry, papery sound that scraped Kael's nerves. A guard stepped to the edge of the platform, a lean woman with a scarf wrapped over her mouth, a long rifle slung across her chest. The speaker horn lowered. "Red Mesa's closed. Quarantine. Turn back or we fire." Kael didn't turn. He took a single step forward, hands still visible. "I have 17 people who need water and a wall between them and the highway. Don't care." The bell tide hit a scav camp 2 days west. Anyone from the road could be carrying it. "We're from Bell's Junction. The tide already hit us." Kael let the words hang in the dust. "We're not carriers. We're survivors." A second guard, a heavy-set man with a bandolier of shotgun shells, leaned over the rail. His face was sun-blistered and suspicious. "Heard about Bell's Junction. Whole place gone. That means anyone coming from there is either lucky or bait." Kael's jaw tightened. "My name is Kael. I have a ledger that says Red Mesa owes me 300 gallons of stored rainwater from the winter deal. I'm not here to collect. I'm here to trade." For a long moment, no one answered. The heavy-set guard, Marlin, wiped his nose with the back of a glove. The woman with the scarf, Ilsa, Kael would learn later, kept the rifle barrel leveled at his chest. "Then you know the rules. No outsiders inside the walls until the quarantine judges say otherwise. Then I'll deal with the judges. The judges won't see you. They've got enough on their plates without opening the gate for a line of walking corpses." Kael's thumb rubbed the leather cover of the ledger. He could feel the refugees behind him shifting, their thirst a physical weight. A mother shushed the coughing baby, but the cough came again, dry and desperate. The sound tightened something in Kael's chest. He made a decision. "There's a spring 3 miles east of here," he said, loud enough for the whole wall to hear. "Not on any map. It's inside a collapsed chicken farm, under a slab of concrete. Cold water, seeping through limestone. I drank from it 18 days ago. It hasn't gone dry." The rifle barrel didn't move. Marlin leaned farther over the rail. "Liar. Send 2 people with me. I'll walk them to the edge of the property and point to the exact crawl space. If there's no water, you can shoot me where I stand." The guards exchanged a look. Ilsa lowered the speaker horn completely. "Half the water in a spring we can't verify is worth nothing. It's worth a future debt. I'm not asking for a permanent home. I'm asking for 8 hours inside your walls, quarantine yard, shaded water, 1 meal. After that, if your judges still say no, we leave. But we leave watered." Marlin laughed, a short, humorless bark. "You think 8 hours of water is worth a spring? It's not just water. It's a route." Kael pulled the ledger free, just enough to show the cracked leather cover with its rows of faded ink. "I know every dry wash and rat-free path from here to the Green River. Red Mesa might be fine behind walls now, but a fortified settlement is only as good as its water lies. Your cisterns are low. I can smell the alkali on the wind." The lie was small, he couldn't actually smell water levels. But the guards couldn't know that. And he did know the Red Mesa well logs from a debt 2 seasons back. Their main aquifer had dropped 20 feet after the last drought. Marlin's hand twitched on his weapon. Ilsa stared down at Kael for a long 7 seconds. Then she spoke. If we send a scout and you're lying, every one of you dies. Kael nodded. Then send a scout. He heard the gate mechanism groan before he saw movement. A smaller hatch, cut into the larger door, swung inward. A wiry man in a patched leather coat slipped out, carrying a machete and a canteen. His eyes were red-rimmed, suspicious. He gave his name as Corvo after a minute of silence, then fell in 2 paces behind Kael, the machete loose in his grip. Kael turned to the convoy. A teenage boy at the front with a salvaged spear, Pim, started to follow. Kael shook his head. Stay with the others. If I'm not back by nightfall, head for the old truck stop on Route 6 and wait 2 days. Pim opened his mouth to argue but closed it. Kael had already saved them once. They trusted him enough to let him walk away. The desert stretched around them, tan and cracked. Heat shimmered over the road. Kael led Corvo off the highway after half a mile, cutting across a field of rabbit brush and shattered glass. The sun bled lower, painting the clouds the color of old bruises. Under the collapsed roof of an old chicken barn, they found it, a dark opening between 2 slabs of concrete. The smell of damp stone rose from the hole. Corvo crouched, reached down with the canteen, and brought it up dripping. He sniffed, then poured a little into his palm. Clear, cold. Hell, Corvo whispered. It's real. Kael said nothing. He was already calculating the cost. 1 water source, spent. In his ledger, the spring had been a bargaining chip for the Green River trade route. Now it was gone, traded for 8 hours of shade and a future debt. He pulled the ledger from his coat, found the page with Red Mesa's existing debts, and added a single line in pencil, future debt, 1 claim, no questions, transferable to my heir. The ink was graphite, but it felt like blood. They walked back to Red Mesa in silence. The gate opened wide enough for the refugees to pass through, one by one, while the wall guards kept rifles trained. Inside, a quarantine yard had been set up near the south wall, a rectangle of packed dirt marked with white lime, a few canvas awnings, and 3 buckets of water on a wooden table. It smelled of sweat, ash, and antiseptic made from boiled creosote. The refugees drank, then sat or lay down in the dust. Kael moved among them, checking for fever. None. He pressed a wet cloth to the baby's lips. The mother, a woman with a shaved head and cracked lips, whispered thanks. Kael nodded but did not answer. Corvo and Marlin stood at the edge of the yard. Ilsa appeared from a guard post. You get 8 hours, she said. The judges will come at dusk. You'll speak to them then. Don't cause trouble. Kael nodded. He found a patch of shade near the wall and sat down, his back against the warm concrete. For the first time since Bell's Junction, he allowed himself to close his eyes. Not sleep. Just a moment of stillness. A shadow fell over him. He opened his eyes. A woman knelt in front of him, close enough that he could see the sunburned lines around her mouth and the grease in her hair. She wore a faded blue shawl stained with old blood, and in one hand she held a small bell made from a tin can, the kind scavengers hung on their packs to warn away stalking animals. You, she breathed. You traded here last season. I remember your face. Kael's hand went to the ledger, but he didn't open it. I trade a lot of places. No. You came with 4 mules and sold water filters to the East Block. Her voice was a dry whisper. After you left, the bells started missing. My boy's bell, gone from the fence. Old Ren's bell, gone from his cart. 3 days later, the first scout saw the tide on the highway, black shapes, wearing our bells. She stared at him, her eyes glassy. You broke. Chapter 7, The Quarantine Betrayal. The bells started after moonrise, though not as a scream. They began as 1,000 thin voices of tin and copper rubbing against leather, a rustling at first, almost like wine through dry reeds, then a metallic shiver that gathered strength. By the time the moon had cleared the eastern ridge and turned the dust in the air to silver, the bells had become a constant, breathing drone. It set Kael's teeth on edge, not from the pitch but from the persistence. Every clapper wore its chord, every tongue scraped its rim, and the whole yard vibrated with that small, grinding music. He felt it in his jawbone and in the hollow place behind his sternum, as if the sound had found a way inside him and was trying to polish his ribs. Kael sat with his back against the cracked adobe wall of the quarantine yard. He had chosen the spot an hour after sunset, not for comfort but for the way the wall's broken plaster mapped a pattern of cooler and warmer patches against his spine. The adobe had been baked all day by a sun that had no mercy, and now, hours into the night, it still bled heat into his shoulders. A chunk of mud plaster had crumbled away beneath his left shoulder blade, and every breath pressed the hard grain of straw and clay against his shirt. He kept his knees drawn up just high enough to balance the ledger, the leather cover gone tacky where it rested against his thigh. The position made his lower back ache, but moving would mean giving up the small territory he had claimed, a narrow strip of wall where the stench from the ditch was not quite so strong, and where the bells came at him from only one direction. His ledger lay open on his knee. The pages had gone soft with humidity and dust, so soft that when he turned one, it made no rustle, only a limp, damp whisper like a hand dragged over stone. The ink still held, though. He traced a column of names with one fingertip, feeling the slight raised texture where the quill had bitten into the paper, the way each letter had dried into a tiny ridge. Some names were clear, others had blurred at the edges, the ink bleeding sideways into the fibers as if the paper had tried to swallow them. He did not need to read the names to know them. He had written each one himself, seated cross-legged in the gatehouse with a line of refugees straggling past, and he could still see their faces in the manner of their hands, the way they clutched their papers or children or the small sacks of whatever they had managed to carry. The ledger was the only thing in the yard that felt certain. Numbers did not lie, even when he wanted them to. He had not slept. That was not unusual, he had trained himself to survive on shallow rest, the kind that came in 20-minute shifts, always with one ear open. But this night was different. This night he had not even tried. His eyes felt packed with sand, and every time he blinked, his lids scraped across them like dry parchment. The corners of his mouth had cracked in the heat, and when he ran his tongue over them, he tasted salt and dust and the faint copper tang of his own blood from a split in his lower lip. He pressed the split with his thumb, not to stop the bleeding, but because the small pain helped him focus. It kept the long gray hum of exhaustion from pulling him under. The refugees lay in rows under scavenged canvas, and the canvas did not cover them so much as lean over them. It had been patched together from sailcloth, tents, wagon covers, even a length of striped awning that had once shaded a market stall. The stripes had faded to the color of old bone and blood. Between the sheets of canvas, gaps opened and closed with every breath of wind, and through those gaps Kael could see the bodies beneath, not moving, not resting, but suspended in that heavy stillness that came when fear and fatigue exhausted each other. Some had pulled their blankets over their heads against the dust, others lay with faces turned up, eyes open or shut, he could not tell in the uncertain light. The air above them shimmered with the heat still rising from their bodies, and beneath that heat lay the smell, sweat, sour and sweet, the mineral reek of fever, the sharp ghost of lye someone had used to scrub a pot, and under it all the faint, insistent rot of the drainage ditch that ran along the north wall. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat and would not wash away. And every time the wind shifted, the sound of bells washed over them like dry water. It did not come in waves so much as in pulses, a tide made of noise rather than sea, rising and falling without ever truly stopping. When the wind moved from the north, the bells by the gate answered; when it turned east, a different set of bells, higher and thinner, took up the song. The sound spilled over the rows of canvas, over the cracked adobe, over the bare dirt packed hard by 100 frightened feet, and it filled the spaces between the sleeping and the waking. No one spoke. There had been talk earlier, whispers, prayers, a few sharp words swallowed quickly, but now the yard had gone silent, and the bells seemed to speak for all of them, 1,000 small metal mouths that never needed to breathe. The baby had stopped crying an hour ago, and that silence was worse. Kael had been counting the cries without meaning to, marking each ragged wail as it rose and fell, listening for the hitch that meant the child was settling or the shudder that meant it was not. The baby had cried in fits, thin and furious, for most of the evening, the kind of cry that stripped the air from the yard and left everyone holding their own breath. Then, an hour ago, it had simply stopped. Not faded, not softened into whimpering, but stopped, as if a door had closed. Kael had told himself it was only exhaustion. Infants wore themselves out, that was true. But he had not heard the mother's voice since, and he had not heard the small wet sounds of feeding or the shuffle of a woman rocking her child in the dark. The absence of those sounds pressed against his eardrums more painfully than any bell. He wanted to get up, to walk between the rows and look, but the guard light had already started its first sweep, and moving now would draw attention. So he stayed where he was, his thumb still against the split in his lip, and let the silence dig into him like a splinter. A beam of light swept across the top of the east wall, stopped, and swept again. It came from the guard tower, a carefully hooded lantern with a polished tin reflector, and it moved with a mechanical patience that Kael had come to know over the past 3 nights. The light was not harsh, it had to pass through a film of dust and wood smoke, and by the time it reached the wall it had softened to the color of weak tea, a diluted yellow that made the crumbling parapet look like old cheese. But it was steady. It did not waver. Kael watched it track from left to right, a measured arc that began at the corner of the gatehouse and ended at the secondary watch post. When it reached the end, it held for a moment, 5 seconds, perhaps 6, then swung back in the opposite direction, slower on the return, as if the guard were trying to read the shadows rather than simply dispel them. Kael counted the seconds. He did it without moving his lips, using the pulse in his wrist as a metronome. 1, and the light crossed the first section of wall, where the plaster had flaked away in the shape of a bird's wing. 2, and it touched the gap between the second and third support posts. 3, and it dipped down, just slightly, toward the edge of the canvas, then rose again with a sudden correction. 4, and it reached the corner, held, and reversed. He counted not because he needed to know the exact time, there was no clock in the yard, and the moon had already told him all he needed about the hour, but because the rhythm gave him something to do, a structure to hang his attention on so that the waiting did not become thinking. If he stopped counting, he would start wondering about the baby, about the border, about the supply cart that was already 2 days late, about all the ways the next morning might go wrong. The counting kept those thoughts at arm's length, just behind the number, where they could mutter but not shout. The guard in the tower was good enough to search, not good enough to relax. Kael had decided this on the second night, and nothing since had changed his mind. The guard did not rush, he did not skip sections, he did not let the light linger too long in one place or skim too quickly over another. But there was a stiffness in the way the beam moved, a predictability, as if the guard had learned the pattern by rote and could not break it. A better watchman would vary the rhythm, sometimes holding at a corner, sometimes reversing mid-sweep, sometimes letting the light die altogether for a few heartbeats to keep the darkness honest. This one did none of that. The gray light bled over the mesa's eastern rim, weak as water beneath ice. Kael stood at the back of the convoy, counting heads by habit. 47. Down from 52 at Bell's Junction. The missing 5 had chosen the quarantine walls of Red Mesa over the road. He did not blame them. The road had become a mouth. Bells. Faint as a child's toy lost in a field. Then another. A third. The tide never stopped. Move, Kael said. No rifle. No gun. Only the leather satchel slung crossbody against his ribs, holding the ledger. The refugees obeyed anyway. 6 days of running had taught them that the man with the notebook knew when the wind shifted danger before the dust rose. Tandy walked near the front, cracked lips moving in silent count. She carried a plastic jug with 1 cup of murky water left. Oban, the old well digger, limped beside her. Half his left foot was wrapped in cloth stiff with old blood. He never complained. That worried Kael more than the bells. The canyon waded west of Red Mesa, a slit in the earth where the old highway sank between sandstone walls. Kael had mapped it in the ledger months ago. Page 31. Canyon route, no water, hard shade, 2 collapses beyond mile marker 14. The second collapse had never been recorded. His own notations ended with a question mark. The convoy entered the canyon just as the sun cleared the rim. The heat came fast, baking the dew off the rocks. Bells grew louder behind them, not a constant ring but a layer of sound, like metal seeds shaken in a dry gourd. Don't look back, Kael said. Keep your feet on the white line. The old highway paint was nearly gone. Here and there a scuffed stripe of white showed through the sand. The refugees followed it like scripture. Tandy's son stumbled. The boy was 7, maybe 8. He had not spoken since Bell's Junction. He wore a bell around his neck, the handmade kind the scavengers had sold at market. Kael had wanted to tear it off, to throw it into the scrub. But the boy clutched it at night, and no one had the heart to take it. Now the bell hung silent, stuffed with a rag to stop its tongue. The canyon narrowed. The walls rose 30 feet, then 50, red rocks scarred by old dynamite drills. Kael felt the temperature drop as they entered the shade. The roar of bells behind them changed pitch, bouncing off rock. Close now. Too close. Oban, Kael said. The mine entrance. How far? The old man squinted. Maybe half a mile. If the roof hasn't caved. They had no half mile. The tide was faster than their weakest. Kael knew the math. 6 days of rationed water, 2 cups per person per day. The old and the young were slowing. The mutants did not slow. He pulled the ledger from the satchel, flipped to a page without stopping his stride. His fingers found the entry he wanted. San Rafael Mine, vertical shaft, tool cache in the foreman's locker. Blasting caps. 6 sticks gelignite. Unstable timbers. Do not enter after rain. It was a warning in his own handwriting. But the rain had not come in months. The timbers would be dry. Dry meant they would crack and burn. Get to the mine, Kael said, raising his voice. Double time. Leave the heavy jugs. A woman named Cora clutched a metal can filled with beans. We can't leave food. Leave it. You'll eat tonight or you will not eat again. Move. They moved. The canyon floor sloped upward, then cut left around a fallen boulder. The mine entrance appeared as a black mouth set into the canyon wall, half hidden behind a collapsed ore cart and a rusted winch. The timbers above the entrance listed to one side like teeth gone loose. Bells. Louder now. The sound had shape, not a wave but a tide, a pressure against the eardrums. Kael pointed at the entrance. Inside. All of you. Find the foreman's locker. Bring me the blasting caps and the sticks. Any wire. Any fuse. Go. The refugees hesitated. The dark inside the mine was absolute. I'll stay with the rear, Kael said. Oben, you know mining. Go with them. Check the timbers. Oben nodded once. I know the San Rafael. My brother worked it, before. The group filed in. Their footsteps echoed back, muffled by dust. Tandy was the last to disappear. She looked at Kael with something like apology, then vanished into the black. Kael turned to face the canyon. The bell sound was so loud now that he could feel it in his teeth. He had no rifle. He had only the ledger and a box of scavenged blasting material on its way out of the mine. He counted seconds. The tide was perhaps 2 minutes behind. He could smell it, a musk like wet ash and copper. The first of them would round the boulder soon. He had seen them from a distance at Bell's Junction, black figures with bells tied to their wrists, their ankles, their rib cages. Silent except for the bells. No howling. No war cries. That silence was worse than noise. Kael. Oben's voice, from inside the mine. Got the locker open. 2 caps, but the fuse is dry-rotted. Then tie the caps to wire, Kael shouted back. Long as you can find. Set the charges at the entrance supports. The 2 load-bearing timbers. They'll bring down the whole mouth. That's the point, Kael said. Set them and get back. He did not look away from the canyon. The first bell came around the boulder, a shape too fast for its size. It wore a scavenger's coat, the seams split open. Bells hung from the coat like scales. Its face was not a face but a map of old burns and new growth. It did not scream. It simply ran. Kael turned and sprinted into the mine. The darkness swallowed the sunlight in 3 strides. He stumbled over the cart rail, caught himself on the wall. The cool air inside carried the smell of rust and sulfur. Where's the wire? He called. A child's voice answered, trembling, they're coming. Not yet, they're not. Kael found a flashlight in his satchel, clicked it on. The beam cut through the dust. The refugees were pressed against the walls, 30 feet deep. The mine tunnel sloped down ahead of them, vanishing into black. At the entrance, Oben was rigging the charges, his hand surprisingly steady. The supports are rotten, Oben said. 1 charge at each base. Wire runs back to the winch. How long? 40 feet. Not long enough for safety. It's long enough for what it needs to do. Kael took the wire from Oben's chapped fingers. The end was twisted around a matchstick, crude but functional. He backed down the tunnel, paying out the wire. Everyone get behind the big ore cart. Now. The refugees scrambled. Tandy pulled her son behind the rusted cart. Cora covered her head. Oben limped deeper, waving the others with his good hand. Kael stopped at the cart. The flashlight lay on the ground, aimed at the entrance. He could hear the bells inside the mine mouth now, the first of the mutants scraping against timber and stone. The wire felt thin as a tendon in his hand. He touched the second wire end to the flashlight's battery terminal. Nothing. A spark, faint, jumped. Again. The charge did not fire. The bells came closer. A mutant stepped into the flashlight's beam, its bell coat catching the light, its mouth open in a soundless scream. Kael stripped the rag from the boy's bell. He shook it once. The clapper rang, high and small. The mutant's head turned toward the sound, toward him. The others behind it crowded the entrance. He touched the wire to the terminal again. Held it. The spark bit. The world went white. The noise arrived before the rock did, a crack like a giant's knuckles popping. The timbers at the entrance burst inward. The tunnel shook. Dust and shards of sandstone shot through the beam. Then the ceiling came down in a slab, one great sheet of stone that cut the entrance in half, then in half again, cascading until the daylight disappeared behind a wall of falling rock. The blast wave threw Kael into the cart. His head struck rusted iron. He tasted blood. The flashlight spun away, then died. Darkness. Total. The ground still shifted beneath him, rumbling like distant thunder. Somebody screamed. It was the child. The air grew thick with dust. Kael could not see his hand in front of his face. He could not hear the bells anymore. Only the groaning of the earth, settling into its new shape. Everyone still breathing, he called. A chorus of coughs answered. Then Tandy's voice, the entrance. It's gone. I know. Kael turned his head in the dark, listening. The collapse had not stopped at the entrance. He could hear rocks shifting deeper in the tunnel, rolling down the slope. The passage ahead might be sealed too. He did not know. The ledger could not tell him. This was the part no map had recorded. He found the flashlight by feel, clicked it. The bulb flickered once, then died for good. Batteries gone or broken. In the dark, Oben spoke quietly, the air's already getting close. 47 of us in a sealed tunnel. We have maybe 2 hours. 3 if we don't move. Chapter_title, below the black, content, the dark was not empty. It had weight, a grit fine pressure that closed over Kael /U 2019's eyes and made the black behind his lids no different from the black in front. Each breath came through his teeth tasting of stone dust and spent blasting powder. The collapse had stopped, but the silence after it was worse, broken only by the drip of something too slow to be water and the rustle of 47 people trying not to breathe too loud, /n/na bell rang beyond the fall, /n/n Kael froze. It was not the deep clang of iron, but the small tin note of a goat bell, the kind sewn to a scavenger /U 2019's belt. Another answered from deeper in the mine. Then another. They came one at a time, patient, unhurried, like signals moving along a wire, /n/n /U 201 cd /U 2019 re inside /U 201d a man whispered, and the whisper became a woman /U 2019's scream. /U 201 cd /U 2019 re already inside, /U 201d /n Tandy /U 2019's child began to cry. She pressed his face to her shoulder, and the sound became a muffled animal keen. Bodies surged against Kael in the dark. Someone /U 2019's elbow caught him under the ribs. A foot stamped down beside his hand, /n /U 201 c quiet, /U 201d Kael hissed, but his voice was a dry rasp. He grabbed the nearest arm and twisted. /U 201 c noise will bring them faster. You want to die breathing, /U 201d /n the screaming stuttered. For a moment there was only the shifting of feet and the distant bells, /n then a canteen clattered against stone, empty. The sound had finality, /n /U 201 c water /U 2019's gone, /U 201d a voice said. /U 201 c the last one /U 2019's dry, /U 201d n /U 201 c liar, /U 201d another voice shouted. /U 201 c you took it, /U 201d n na fist connected with something soft. The crowd surged again. Kael put his back against the wagon wheel and spread his arms, but in the dark it meant nothing. The wagon rocked. Chapter_title, Chapter 10, The Depot's Price. Content, Kael pressed his palm flat against the rust-pitted steel of the access door, feeling the faint vibration of machinery through the metal. Behind him, Marin shifted on the balls of his feet, his breath a ragged cloud in the cold underground air. Sable crouched lower, her fingers white on the strap of a canvas satchel, /and nothing for the first 10 meters, Kael whispered, not turning his head. Then we have light. Stay against the left wall until I tell you otherwise, and he pushed the door. It opened with a scream of decayed hinges that seemed to echo down the dark corridor. Pale blue emergency lights buzzed to life, revealing a long concrete ramp descending into the depot's main floor. The air grew thick with the smell of old oil, copper, and something sweeter, something that had been dead long enough to dry, and Kael stopped halfway. Below, the warehouse opened in a cavern of shadow and scattered light. Metal shelving stretched in rows, piled with crates wrapped in mildewed canvas. A gantry overhead held a motionless chain hoist. And near a collapsed pallet jack, 3 shapes lay in a fan of blackened blood. Soldiers. Their uniforms had not rotted away but been shredded, torn by high-velocity rounds. Their helmets were dented. One still had a boot propped against a crate, as if he had tried to crawl, and na red dot swept across the floor, and Kael's hand lashed out, pressing Marin back against the wall. Sable froze mid-step. The red dot glided from left to right, paused on the nearest corpse, then moved on. A second dot appeared from the opposite direction, crossing the first, and motion-triggered turrets, Kael said, his voice barely audible. Don't move. Don't even breathe heavy, and the turrets were mounted on curved tracks bolted to the ceiling, their black barrels slim and angular, swiveling with a mechanical precision that made his stomach drop. He had seen them in an old maintenance manual years ago, Harbinger 440 sentry units. Motion sensors, 12-round burst, autonomous targeting. They had a blind spot directly beneath each mounting bracket, but the floor pattern suggested 2 units with overlapping arcs. No safe pathway across the open area, and Marin's eyes were wide. Can we go back, and the only way back is the drainage culvert, and it's flooding with the evening runoff. We came here for supplies. That door behind the turrets is the main storage vault. Food, water, ammunition, Kael kept his eyes on the sweeping dots. We need that vault or the convoy dies before Red Mesa gets another shipment, and he eased the satchel from his shoulder and unzipped it. Inside lay his ledger, a thick, battered notebook bound in cracked leather and held shut by a length of wire. He opened it to a section near the back, where pages had been folded and tucked. They were photocopies, smeared with grease and water stains, but the diagrams were still legible. Depot 9 power distribution grid, for 40th century wiring schematic, breaker relay layout, and he had traded for these copies 3 years ago from a dead scavenger's pack. Knowledge he had kept in his ledger because he never knew when he might need to break into a pre-war supply depot, and the sentries run on a central relay in the electrical room, he murmured, tracing the lines with a fingernail. That room is accessed through a cable-pulling crawlspace under the floor. The manual shows a maintenance hatch near the west corner, just behind that stack of water tanks, he pointed. There's a blind spot along the base of the wall where the turret sensor can't see because the cable tray casts a shadow. If I stay low and move when the dot sweeps past, I can reach the hatch, and Sable shook her head. It's suicide. Those things cut through 3 soldiers, and they didn't know the pattern, Kael looked at her, his eyes flat. I do. The sweep takes 4 seconds left, 3 seconds right, with a 2-second pause at midpoint. I've been counting. When I reach the hatch, I'll drop into the crawlspace and follow the cable run to the breaker room. I can reroute power, drain the backup battery into the drainage pump, and kill the sentry circuit, and he didn't mention that if the manual was wrong, or if the relay had been serviced since the fall, he would never come back. There was no point, and stay here, he said. If I don't return, wait for the turrets to run out of ammunition. They have a finite belt supply. That could be hours or days. If the lights go out, use the glow sticks in my pack. Don't come looking for me, and he slid the ledger back into the satchel and buckled it, too tight across his chest. Then he stepped away from the wall and began his crawl, and the concrete was cold and gritty under his palms. He stayed in the shadow of the cable tray, his body pressed so low his chin scraped the floor. The red dot swept past his left elbow, close enough to feel the faint warmth of the laser. He counted in his head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The dot flicked back. He moved then, a quick scuttle, staying behind a rusted wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow's shadow offered a sliver of cover. The turret's second unit swept from the right. He flattened behind the metal side, holding his breath as the dot tracked over the top edge, 1 inch from his knuckles, /n the hatch was 10 feet away. He could see it now, a square steel plate set into the floor, its handle wrapped in brittle yellow tape. The manual had said it would be unlocked because maintenance crews needed frequent access to the cable pull. He hoped that was still true, /n the left turret's dot reached the far right and paused. The right turret was still sweeping. In that 2-second gap, Kael lunged. His boots scraped, his elbow cracked against the floor, but he threw himself at the hatch, fingers catching the handle. He yanked. The plate lifted with a screech of rusted hinges, /n he dropped through, pulling the cover down behind him just as the red dot passed over the spot where his head had been, /n the crawlspace was black. He fumbled in his pocket for a chemical light stick, cracked it, and shook it until green light bloomed. The space was no more than 3 feet high, filled with cable bundles running along steel brackets. Dust floated in the green glow. Rat droppings and the skeletons of small animals littered the floor. The air was stale, sharp with the smell of burnt insulation, /n he crawled forward, following the red and black cables that matched the manual's diagram. The green light caught numbers stenciled on the wall, P4, P5, P6. At P7, the conduit turned left into a steel box bolted to the wall. The relay panel, /n Kael sat back on his heels, his neck bent against the low ceiling. He opened the panel. Inside, 3 rows of breakers glowed with tiny indicator lights. Sentry primary, sentry backup battery, ventilation, drainage pump, lighting. He pulled the manual pages from his satchel and spread them on the floor, comparing the wire colors. Red for positive DC, black for negative, yellow for AC control, /n the manual had a hand-drawn note in the margin / to manually disable M440, do not cut primary only. Units auto-switch to battery. Reroute battery leads to a non-critical load and then open primary breaker. Battery drains in 90 seconds, /n that was the dangerous part. He had to disconnect the backup battery terminal and attach it to the drainage pump's positive lead. If he did it wrong, the battery would short and the sentries might interpret the power surge as a command to fire. Or the whole relay would burn, /n he used his multi-tool, pulling the wire stripper from the handle. The copper wire was cold and brittle. He stripped a half-inch of insulation from the battery's positive cable, then from the drainage pump's feed. He unscrewed the backup battery terminal from its post. The manual said to insulate the negative lead first. He wrapped the black battery cable with a strip of cloth from his torn sleeve and taped it away from the panel, /n then he joined the battery positive to the pump terminal. He tightened the screw, his fingers slipping on the small metal plate. The pump's breaker was still off. He reached up and flipped it on. A distant hum started through the floor, the drainage sump kicking in. The battery indicator light on the sentry panel flickered from green to amber, /n now he had to open the sentry primary breaker. If he did, the battery would try to keep the turrets alive by draining into the pump. The manual said the pump's draw was enough to collapse the battery in under 2 minutes. He counted 10 seconds to be sure, then reached for the primary breaker, /n he flipped it, /n somewhere above, the hum of the turrets died. The amber battery light glowed for a long time, then faded. The pump continued to whine, gurgling as it pushed water out of some sublevel. Kael waited, counting to 90. The light went out, /n he exhaled. Chapter_title, The Price of Passage, Content, the knife point sat just under Kael /u 2019's jaw, cold as a north-facing wall, not yet drawing blood but close enough that he could feel his pulse tapping against the steel. The woman holding it did not blink. Her breath came fast and wet, scoured by ash, and her knuckles were white around a wrapped leather handle. Behind her, the sound of the second swarm rolled up the old approach road like a dry wind dragging 10,000 tin pins through dead brush, /n Kael did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He kept his chin at the exact angle that kept the blade from sliding deeper and watched her eyes, because eyes told you whether a person had crossed from rage into the place where killing became easy. She had not crossed yet. Her hand trembled with more than fear, /n U201 CU brought this, /U201D she said. Backslash U201CU and your little book of roads. You brought the bells to Red Mesa, and now you brought them here. Backslash U201D backslash N backslash N behind her. 61 other refugees crouched behind a cracked concrete Jersey barrier. Some of them were from Bell backslash U 2019's Junction. Some from Red Mesa. A child had been crying since before the last elevation rise, a thin sound almost lost under the growing wash of bells. Kael could smell dust and old diesel, the copper tang of blood where someone had scraped their knee climbing a ditch, and the faint brine of frightened bodies packed too close together for too many days. Backslash N backslash and the bell sound changed. It came in short gusting surges, as if the horde moved in waves around folds of blackened asphalt. That was worse than a constant noise. It meant they were close enough now that the road bends and the dead ground could scatter the sound. Kael had counted their clusters from the last steep grade. Maybe 8 minutes. Maybe less. Backslash N backslash N backslash U201CIF you cut my throat. Backslash U201D Kael said, his voice level. Backslash U201CIU will stand here and watch that door stay shut until the bells reach the ramp. Backslash U201D backslash N backslash and the blade pressed harder. A warm line ran down the side of his neck and into the collar of his shirt. He refused to swallow. Swallowing would make it feel like acceptance. Backslash N backslash N backslash U201CI Don backslash U2019 T care. Backslash U201D the mother said, but the word split in the middle. Backslash N backslash N backslash U201CU care. Backslash U201D Kael said. Backslash U201CU came this far because you care about the ones behind you. Put it down. The man inside is watching. If he sees you kill me, he will seal the outer door and use us as a bell trap. Backslash U201D backslash N backslash N. For a long moment nothing happened except a piece of grit rattled along the concrete between their feet. Then the mother lowered the knife. It hung at her side, still unsheathed, but the point was no longer at his throat. Kael exhaled through his nose and pressed 2 fingers to the cut. His hand came away smeared red. Not deep. Backslash N above the steel-shuttered entry, a speaker grill crackled. The voice that came out had the flat, clipped edges of someone who had once given orders before static ruined everything. Backslash N backslash U201C step away from the gate. Backslash U201D backslash N Kael turned. The bunker backslash U2019's outer door was a slab of rolled steel set into a concrete berm, its original paint long gone to rust. A narrow vision port sat at head height, half clogged with wind-blown grit. The bunker commander was not visible, but Kael knew he had been watching. The camera above the port moved with a dry click. It was old, wired, and someone had cleaned the lens recently enough that it did not glare. Backslash N backslash U201CMY name is Kael. Backslash U201D he said. Backslash U201CI was a supply chain auditor before the road stopped paying. I have 62 people here. Most are from Bell backslash U2019's Junction. A few joined us outside Red Mesa. We have no food, less water, and one woman with a knife who wants to give me to the things on the road. Backslash U201D backslash N backslash U201CU backslash U2019 re on Federal Depot ground. Backslash U201D the commander said. Backslash U201C we don backslash U2019 T take names. We seal at first bell. U backslash U2019 LLB outside. Backslash U201D backslash N and the mother made a noise like a broken laugh. Backslash U201C I told you. Kael sees a door and thinks he can talk it open. Backslash U201D backslash N Kael moved a step closer to the port. The bell sound swelled again, and for the first time he could pick out individual notes, small and tarnished, almost musical, as if the dead wore bells on their wrists and ankles and dragged them over the earth without any attempt to muffle the noise. The bell tie did not scream. It did not roar. It only announced itself with a sound like dry seed pods, and that made the waiting worse. Backslash N U201C commander. Backslash U201D Kael said. Backslash U201 have a problem. The second swarm ISN backslash U2019 T moving through this valley by chance. They follow old highways. Your western vent shafts sit less than 400 yards from the D6 loop road. If you seal now, you backslash U2019 LL still have them pressing into the intake grates by midnight. That means dust, clogged filters, maybe a pressure failure in the lower gallery. I know the safe route around it. Their backslash U2019 SA rad-free drainage pipe under the west ramp that can vent your scrubbers without pulling surface dust. You backslash U2019 V been running hot for days. I can see the rust weep from the overflow pipe behind you, U201D /N/N silence from the speaker except the faint boom of a closing inner latch. The camera word again, /N/N U201C you can see that from outside, U201D /N/N U201C I can read what the depot tells me, U201D Kael said. U201CI U2019 am not asking for charity. Open the outer and inner doors. Give these people water, no beatings, and 2 meals. In exchange, I will give you my ledger. Every debt, every water source, every safe route within 1,000 miles. The bell-tied U2019's road patterns are in there too. You can use them to keep this bunker from becoming a bell jar, U201D /N the mother shifted. U201C your ledger. That U2019's everything, U201D /N/N U201CIT U2019's a book, U201D Kael said without looking at her. U201CIT1 U2019T stop a bell, U201D /N and the commander spoke again U201C62. I can take 40. The ledger first. Then I open, U201D /N/N U201CNO U201D Kael said. U201C62, all of them. The ledger comes with me. When they are inside and the inner door is cycled, I will hand it through the transfer slot myself. If you try to take it, you U2019 LL get a corpse and a notebook you can U2019T read. A third of the water sources are marked in my own shorthand. Without me, half of those safe routes will lead your patrols into the same deadfoot sink the Horde uses for its north edge. You may not trust me, Commander. I wouldn't U2019T trust me either. But I am giving you the only thing that makes me dangerous, U201D /N/N Kael pulled the ledger from inside his coat. It was not large. Dark cloth covers, water-stained page edges, a loop of braided wire holding the spine together. The mother stared at it as if it had just grown teeth. The refugees behind the barrier began to move, some of them standing, their faces white with road dust, /N/N the bell sound rolled closer. Somewhere out in the heat, a piece of sheet metal bent with a slow scream, /N/N U201C Commander, U201D Kael said, U201 you have maybe 7 minutes before the first rank reaches the fuel tank. I counted their bell clusters at the last switchback. They hug the asphalt. You can watch me. I am not bluffing with a knife at my throat and the dead on this hill, U201D /N/N and the speaker crackled. U201 cooter door is cycling. Single file. Hands open. Any weapon and I close it, U201D /N/ na red light began to turn above the door. Grit sifted down from the rusted frame. The heavy steel slab ground upward, not fast, and behind it a second barrier waited, a gate of vertical bars with a narrow gap. Cool air spilled out, smelling of concrete dust and old rubber and the stale sugar of nutrient stores, /N/ Kael turned to the mother. U201C dropped the knife, U201D /N/ she did not move, /N/ U201C drop it, U201D he said again, U201C or they will drop you, and I won U2019T waste a word trying to stop them, U201D /N/ and the knife clattered on the concrete. One of the older Bell U2019's junction men kicked it away from the threshold, /N/ Kael stood by the opening as the refugees filed past. He counted them. The child came through wrapped in someone U2019's coat. A thin man from Bell U2019's junction stumbled and caught the gate, leaving a bloody handprint. A woman from Red Mesa clutched a dented water tin against her chest as if it were a child. Each face passed under the red light, all of them hollow-eyed, all of them carrying nothing except what they could hold, /N/ when the last refugee was through the outer gate, Kael stepped into the airlock. The outer door began to drop behind him. The speaker voice said, U201C the ledger. In the slot before the inner door moves, U201D /N/ Kael crossed to the inner wall where a steel tray sat beside a small window. He could see the commander now through the layered glass, a gaunt man in faded olive fatigues, his hair cropped gray, a long-barreled pistol at his hip. His face had been burned once on the left side, the skin pulled 2 Chapter 9 Content Summary. Chapter 10 Content Summary. Chapter 11 Content Summary. Chapter 12 Content Summary.